And thank you for coming along tonight to the final session of our book talk series, where we're super lucky to be hosting Professor Kate Crawford, and she'll be discussing her book, The Atlas of AI. And thank you for those who've come along early as well, and for being here on time. And but first, first let me introduce our head of department, Professor Audrey Yu, who will say a few words before we start Kate's talk. Thanks, Audrey.
Thank you, Rosemary. I want to thank everyone to come and extend a warm welcome to everyone here. So our friends, our colleagues in the department, and our friends from far and near, in particular, want to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Kate Crawford. We're very excited to host the Asian launch of Dr. Crawford's new book, Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Costs of Artificial Intelligence, which has just been published by Yale University Press this year. Tonight's book talk is part of our regular seminar series in the Department of Communications and New Media here at the National University of Singapore. Our department focuses on the teaching and research of communication studies from a new media perspective, from the approaches of cultural studies, media effects and political economy, computational communication, communication management, and interactive media design. We are the only department in the Asia Pacific to focus on the spectrum from approaches in critical, qualitative, quantitative, computational, and creative communication studies. So this interdisciplinary way of approaching the field resonates very much with the approach of Dr. Crawford's book that aims to map the atlas, or the topography of AI, as she calls it, through not just the technical domain, so in other words, not just computation, but also as what she writes, and I quote, technical and social practices, institutions and infrastructures, politics and culture, where she combines computational reasoning with embodied work and material culture, using the disciplines that we are very much invested in our department and in our field, from the disciplines of science and technology studies, law, culture studies, material studies, and political philosophy. So our department is delighted to be a part of this new conversation to theorize AI from these perspectives through, and in the book chapters, and our panelists will talk more about that with Professor Crawford, labor, data, classification, affect, the state, space, planet, and power. So as part of social relations, as part of the global extraction industries of data and bodies, Professor Crawford invites us to think about, and I quote, AI as a political, economic, social, and scientific force, unquote. So this provocation is apt not just to our disciplinary department, but also to our university, which is the home or the hub of AI research in Singapore, and also to Singapore itself as a smart nation. So with this preamble, let me congratulate Dr. Crawford on the Asian launch of her new book, Atlas of AI, which has already received wide acclaim from scholars and practitioners worldwide. So please join me now to warmly welcome Professor Crawford and her discussants, Professor Jack Chu and Dr. Kokil Jaidka. Thank you.
Many thanks, Audrey, for that wonderful preamble. Again, we are so happy to welcome Professor Crawford this evening. And I just want to introduce Professor Crawford a little bit and give you a little bit of context with her background. So Kate Crawford is a leading scholar of the social and political implications of AI. Over her 20-year career, her work has focused on understanding large-scale data systems, machine learning and AI in the wider context of history, politics, labour and the environment. She is currently a research professor of communication and STS at USC Annenberg, a senior principal researcher at MSR-NYC, and the inaugural visiting chair for AI and Justice at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. In 2021, she will be the Maigana Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the University of Melbourne and has been appointed an honorary professor at the University of Sydney. Alongside her academic work, Kate Crawford is a fairly prolific public intellectual, and her work has been published in journals like Nature and Communication and Society, but also in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and Harper's. She's also collaborated with a number of visual artists, including Vlad and Joler, and is part of a current exhibition in Kunsthalle Berlin on called Open Secret. And as Audrey has already mentioned, and of course what we're celebrating today, is the launch of her new book, Atlas of AI, published by Yale University Press. And I would love to now hand over to Professor Kate Crawford to deliver her presentation. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, and thank you, Audrey, for that very generous introduction. I also want to give particular thanks to Jack Cho for inviting me to join you as part of this book series today. My only wish is that we were doing this in person, but we'll do our best on Zoom, and hopefully I can give you a slight introduction to some of the work that I've been doing in this book and beyond. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where I am today, the Munsee Lenape, and I recognize their elders past, present, and future. So my work recently has been focusing on the political, social, and ecological implications of artificial intelligence. One of the underlying arguments of Atlas of AI is that we are now looking at the new extractive industry of the 21st century. In today's talk, I'm going to give you a short overview of the themes in this book, and then I'm going to explore some of the underlying dynamics of the wider political economies of AI and planetary computation. Then we'll be moving to a panel discussion and some questions and answers from you as well, if you'd like to join in. So let's start with the deceptively simple question: what is artificial intelligence? Well, if you type in AI into Google image search, this is what you get: blue grids, floating numbers, and men in glasses staring off into the middle distance. You'll also see lots and lots of white robots. And of course, they're always white. This is a deeply problematic but very common framing of AI. It's all very abstract, ethereal, and immaterial. It's the ultimate view from nowhere in the cloud. But if we account for the full materiality of AI, we see that AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. Rather, artificial intelligence requires vast amounts of natural resources, energy, and human labor. It's a giant infrastructure project with logistical demands that span the planet. And in contradistinction to the idea of disembodied brains, AI is not akin to human intelligence, and neither is it autonomous, rational, or able to discern anything without computationally intensive training and predefined rules and rewards. In fact, the design of artificial intelligence as we know it depends entirely on a much wider set of political and social structures. And due to the capital required to build AI at scale, AI systems commonly serve existing dominant interests, such as the military, policing, and the corporate sector. In this sense, we can think of artificial intelligence as a registry of power. So in this book, I use this concept of an atlas, but I'm using it in multiple different ways. I want to essentially leave the nowhere of algorithmic abstraction to see specific somewheres where people and institutions make choices, from the US to Indonesia, Malaysia, China, and the Congo, from the toxic Black Lakes in present-day Mongolia to the extinction of entire species of tree in the Victorian era to produce submarine cables. And this is why I use the concept of an atlas. An atlas is an unusual type of book, one that allows you to look at different scales, from a continent to a mountain range. And we need these scalar shifts, I think, to truly understand something as vast as contemporary networked computation and information capitalism. Perhaps my favorite account of how a cartographic approach can be helpful comes from the physicist Ursula Franklin. She writes, and I quote, "Maps bridge the gap between the known and the as yet unknown. They are testaments of collective knowledge and insight." Likewise, this book owes a great deal to all of the scholars, artists, and advocates that I've worked with over the years who formed my views, including Simone Brown, Wendy Chun, Alondra Nelson, Lucy Suchman, and of course, Jack's own work on labor, which is going to be one of the major themes I discuss today. But maps are also accounts of domination, where territory is carved along the colonial paths of empires. By invoking an atlas, I'm suggesting we need new ways to understand the empires of AI. We need a theory of AI that accounts for the states and corporations that drive it, the extractive mining that marks the planet, the mass capture of data, and the increasingly exploitative labor practices that sustain it. These are the shifting tectonics of power in AI, where the field is explicitly attempting to capture the planet in computationally legible form. So this is not a metaphor so much as the industry's direct ambition. Now, a significant inspiration for me in writing this book was a collaborative project I did with Ladan Jola, where we mapped the entire life cycle of a single Amazon Echo, from the minerals to data processing to device disposal. Now, this project, called Anatomy of an AI System, was actually a much bigger research endeavor than either of us had expected. We started by just looking at how Amazon Echoes harvest data, but then we went much further afield into supply chains, pay scales, smelting practices, and container shipping. When we completed this whole picture, which you can see here, it ended up being something like, I think it's like 7 feet by 5 feet large. It's quite an enormous wall installation. But in doing this, I realized that I wanted to expand this analysis even further, beyond a single device, to consider the entire AI industry itself. So I structured the book around 8 core chapters. It's in some ways a geological strata of AI in the deepest sense, if you will. It starts with the Earth, it moves through labor, data, classification, affect, state, power, and space. But in order to give you the quickest tour through some of the ideas today, I'm going to take a transverse cut through these themes to address just 3 sites of extraction: bodies, time, and space. Or more specifically, deep time, deep tissues, and deep space. On deep time and AI, we'll consider the politics of rocks and brine, because AI is made of minerals and fossil fuels. In deep tissue, we'll consider the politics of ligaments and sweat, because AI is made of human bodies. And finally, we'll go to deep space, which is, of course, the final frontier of AI's extractive vision. So let's turn to the first domain, deep time, and the politics of rocks and brine. Now, we can see the effects of the design of large-scale computation in our atmosphere, our oceans, and the Earth's crust. To understand these implications, I actually went out to multiple mines around the world. This is one, it's in the incorporated community of Silver Peak in Nevada's Clayton Valley. This mining town, which is one of the oldest in Nevada, was almost abandoned in 1917 after the ground was stripped bare of silver and gold. It wasn't until the 1950s until people realized that Silver Peak is perched on the edge of a massive underground lake of lithium. Now the valuable lithium brine under the surface here is being pumped out of the ground and left in these open, iridescent green ponds to evaporate. It's currently the only operating lithium mine in the United States, and it makes it a site of intense interest to Elon Musk and the other tech tycoons for one reason: rechargeable batteries. Here in this remote pocket of Nevada is a place where the stuff of AI is made. Lithium is also known as gray gold. Smartphone batteries, for example, usually have around 7 grams of this material. The Amazon Echo has about double that. But each Tesla Model S car needs about 62 kilograms of lithium for its battery pack. These kinds of batteries were never intended to supply a machine as power hungry as a car, but lithium batteries are currently the only mass market option available. So all of these batteries, of course, have a limited lifespan, and they're very difficult to recycle and are commonly discarded as waste. Clayton Valley is connected to Silicon Valley in much the way that the 19th century goldfields were to San Francisco. Gold and silver once enriched the city and funded its skyscrapers, and now to that list, we can add white lithium crystal. Since antiquity, the business of mining has only been profitable because it does not have to account for its true costs, including land damage, the illness and death of miners, and displaced communities. Back in 1555, Georgius Agricola, known as the father of mineralogy, observed that, and I quote, "It is clear to all that there is greater detriment from mining than the value of the metals which it produces." So a very easy calculus emerged: extract everything as rapidly as possible. It was, if you will, the move fast and break things of a different time. About 200 miles north of Silver Peak is this place. This is the Tesla Gigafactory. It's the world's largest lithium battery plant. And of course, Tesla is the #1 lithium-ion battery consumer in the world, estimated to use more than 28,000 tons of lithium hydroxide annually. That's about half the planet's total consumption. In fact, Tesla could more accurately be described as a battery business than a car company. A 2020 study by the University of Augsburg in Germany modeled how much lithium we may have left to mine. Now, on the most optimistic estimate and assuming best recycling practices, we could see lithium fully depleted a few years after 2100. But without best practices, severe shortages could begin as soon as 2040. We're starting to see, I think, an intimation of what this might be like with the current semiconductor shortage crisis. But of course, the mining that makes AI is both literal and metaphorical. The theorists Sadra Mazadra and Brett Nielsen use the term extractivism to talk about all the different kinds of extractive operations across the supply chains of contemporary capitalism. The new extractivism of data mining also encompasses and propels the old extractivism of traditional mining. Now, in his book, A Geology of Media, the theorist Jussi Parikka suggests that we think of media not as extensions of the human senses, as, of course, Marshall McLuhan argued, but as extensions of Earth. Computational media now participate in geological and climatological processes, from the transformation of the Earth's materials into infrastructures and devices. And we can see here that each object in the extended network of an AI system is built using elements that required billions of years to form inside the Earth. So here, at the moment, we now know that a 21st century person uses around 10 times more minerals than one in the 20th century. For example, in a single smartphone, there are 75 mineralogical elements. That's around 2/3 of the periodic table. So from the perspective of deep time, we're extracting the Earth's geological history to serve a split second of technological time. And of course, this is to build devices that ultimately have around an average lifespan of 4.7 years. That's according to consumer research bodies in the US, before being discarded. Now, all of those phones and AI devices end up here, buried in e-waste dumping grounds, commonly located in places like Thailand, Pakistan, and Ghana. And I think this is why we need to traverse much further than the United States and Europe to see the legacies of the tech industry. And there are many such sites, including the Salar in Southwest Bolivia, which is the richest site of lithium in the world and thus a site of ongoing political conflict, as well as places in the Central Congo, China, Indonesia, and the Western Australian deserts. These are the other birthplaces of AI in the greater geography of industrial computation. Put another way, AI is a mega machine in Lewis Mumford's sense of the word. It goes well beyond databases and algorithms. It is metamorphic, transforming the Earth with manufacturing, transportation, and undersea cables, transmission signals passing through the air, and data sets produced by scraping the internet. And just like traditional forms of mining, the data economy is premised on maintaining a state of ignorance. Here we could think of the work of Hart and Negri, who refer to the dual operation of abstraction and extraction in information capitalism, which means in this context, abstracting away the material conditions of production while extracting ever more information and resources. So let's move now to consider the human layer in AI computation. Now, the common refrain is that we're living in a time of beneficial human-AI collaboration in workplaces. But this collaboration is not being fairly negotiated. After all, do we ever have a choice not to collaborate with algorithmic systems? This is less of a collaboration than it is a duress, where workers are forced to reskill, to keep up, and to unquestioningly accept each new technological development. Rather than representing a radical new shift, the encroachment of AI into the workplace could properly be understood as a return to older practices of industrial labor exploitation. Since the 1890s, factory labor has been increasingly subdivided into smaller actions to better suit machines. So we are witnessing new refrains on an old theme. The crucial difference is that employers now observe, assess, and modulate intimate parts of the work cycle and bodily data, down to the last micro movement of ligaments and facial expressions. For example, in Jeff Bezos's letter to shareholders in April this year, he shared a new vision of how Amazon will deal with the high levels of musculoskeletal disorders suffered by its workers in fulfillment centers. His solution is, of course, a new algorithm that will rotate employees according to the muscle tendon groups that they use. This is surveillance into the deep tissue level of bodies and beyond. Now, bodies are one of the big problems for AI-augmented workplaces. In a recent US survey, 66% of Amazon warehouse workers said that they experience physical pain while performing their regular job, and 42% said that they experience pain when they aren't working, the worst sites being feet, lower backs, and knees. These are the musculoskeletal hotspots of value extraction. Now, instead of supporting unionization or, say, supporting more sustainable working practices, Amazon has for years tried to create mechanized solutions. Back in 2018, as part of the Anatomy of AI project, Vladan and I unearthed a little-known Amazon patent for a system that was designed to keep workers and robots in close proximity. It is a metal cage intended for a worker that can move through a warehouse by using the same motorized system that shifts shelves filled with merchandise. So workers would be held upright in this cage that you see here that would dictate and constrain their movement so they can better work with robots. Now, after we published this project and various news agencies reported on the cage, Amazon spoke to a press in the attempt to reassure people by stating that it never implemented this technology and has no plans to. But the artist Simon Denny fortunately built a physical model of the Amazon worker cage, so now we can all see what this form of human-AI collaboration might look like. But of course, patents aren't necessarily meant to be built. Rather, they are maps of the corporate imaginary. They're a speculative capture of possible designs for the future. Amazon has also patented augmented reality goggles that provide turn-by-turn directions with the potential to track workers' walking speed, dwell time, and eye gaze at all times. This is literally seeing through the eyes of Amazon Corp. Here's another design imaginary. A problem for Amazon is the time it takes to pick and pack multiple items in a large warehouse that requires a lot of walking. And this is something I saw in person when I visited Amazon fulfillment centers when researching this book. And you can see the amount of worker injuries and exhaustion from the physical and psychological stress. So Amazon has now patented aquatic storage facilities to create whole new ways of ordering space. They have suggested to create liquid-filled environments, either in the ocean or elsewhere, to allow for packages to be stored and retrieved in a more efficient way. Depth control devices determine how buoyant the packages are, allowing them to be stacked in layers and then detected via sonar. So as we see, every element of the Earth's environment is being maximized as efficient storage space for the world's biggest logistics company. But at a fundamental level, these ideas of controlled efficiency are not new. Charles Babbage is well known as the inventor of the first mechanical computer in the 1820s, also known as the difference engine. Yet Babbage also saw himself as a social theorist, and he wrote extensively on the nature of labor. In Babbage's more speculative writing, he argued that the industrial corporation should be understood as an analog to a computational system. Just like a computer, it included multiple specialized units, all coordinated to produce a given body of work. He imagined perfect flows moving through the factory that could be visualized ultimately as data tables and monitored by pedometers and clocks. Through a combination of computation, surveillance, and labor discipline, he argued, you could possibly create ever higher degrees of efficiency and quality control. For Babbage, the value of a factory was derived from the design of its manufacturing process rather than from the labor force of its employees. The real innovation was the logistical process, and the workers simply enacted the tasks defined by machines. So for Babbage, labor's role in value production chains was largely negative. Workers might fail to perform their tasks in a timely manner, they got sick, they broke down, or they protested. Only machines could be trusted. In the historian Simon Schaefer's words, for Babbage, factories looked like perfect engines and calculating machines looked like perfect factories. I think it's a very good description of Amazon's vision as well. So among the first industries to implement Babbage's vision of mechanized production was the Chicago meatpacking industry of the 1870s. Trains would bring livestock into the stockyard gates. The animals were funneled towards their slaughter in adjacent plants, and then the carcasses were transported to various butchering and processing stations by means of an overhead trolley system, forming what came to be known as the disassembly line. When Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, his harrowing novel about working class poverty, he set it in the meat packing plants of Chicago. His intended point was to highlight the hardships of the working poor in support of a socialist vision, but in fact, the book had an entirely different effect. The depictions of diseased and rotting meat prompted a public outcry over food safety and resulted in the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. But actually, the focus on workers, which was the point of his book, was entirely lost. So powerful institutions were prepared to try out these new designs for better food safety, but they were not prepared to address the more fundamental exploitative labor dynamics. And I think we can see this pattern playing out over centuries of how power responds to critique. Whether the product is cow carcasses or facial recognition, the response is to accept regulation at the margins, but to leave untouched the underlying logics of production. So what is the latest extension of the practices of extraction beyond the earth and human bodies? Well, now it's space, where the mine that sustains the tech sector extends into the solar system. This is the politics of asteroid mining and deep space colonization. The ideology of these space spectacles is deeply interconnected with that of the AI industry. Extreme wealth and power generated from technology companies now enables a small group of men to pursue their own private space race. Tech billionaires are now competing to see who can leave the planet first. Now, there's a striking promotional video by Jeff Bezos' space company, Blue Origin, that reveals some of the thinking behind this privatized space race. You can hear Jeff Bezos describe it in a voiceover, and I'm going to quote from it here. "This is the most important work I'm doing," he says. "It's a simple argument that this is the best planet, and we face a choice. As we move forward, we're going to have to decide whether we want a civilization of stasis, where we have to cap population, where we will have to cap energy usage per capita, or we can fix that problem by moving out into space." End quote. Now, in the near term, Blue Origin is building reusable rockets and lunar landers at this suborbital base in West Texas. By 2024, the company wants to be shuttling astronauts and cargo to the moon. But in the longer term, the company's mission is far more ambitious, to help bring about a future in which millions are living and working in space. Specifically, Bezos has outlined his hopes to build a giant space colony where people will live in floating manufactured environments. Heavy industry would move off-planet altogether. Meanwhile, Earth would be zoned for residential building and light industry, left as a beautiful place to visit, in his words, presumably for those who can afford it when they're not working in the off-world colonies. If all of this is starting to sound oddly familiar to you, it's because Bezos's inspiration for conquering space comes in part from the science fiction novelist Gerard K. O'Neill. O'Neill wrote a book called The High Frontier. It's a 1976 fantasy of space colonization, which included lush illustrations of moon mining with Rockwellian abundance. Bezos's plan for Blue Origin specifically name checks O'Neill as an inspiration for permanent human settlement in space. In fact, O'Neill's fiction was driven by the dismay and shock that he felt when he read the 1972 landmark report by the Club of Rome called The Limits to Growth. Now, this report published data models that predicted that resources and population was likely to collapse by the year 2100, unless the global policy agenda rapidly reduced the gap between rich and poor nations. In writing The High Frontier, O'Neill wanted to imagine a different way out of a possible no-growth future. By focusing on deep space, O'Neill redirected global anxiety during the 1970s oil crisis with visions of serene space structures that would simultaneously preserve the status quo. And I quote, "If the Earth doesn't have enough surface area," O'Neill said, "then humans should simply build more." End quote. So if we face shortages of key minerals, or if climate change threatens businesses, simply move the extraction horizon ever further out, or so the logic goes. That space colonization and frontier mining have become the common corporate fantasies of tech billionaires, I think underscores a fundamentally troubling relationship to Earth. The language of the tech elite now echoes settler colonialism, seeking to displace Earth's population and capture territory for mineral extraction. Silicon Valley's billionaire space race similarly assumes that the last commons, outer space, can be taken by whichever empire gets there first. This is despite the main convention governing space mining, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which recognizes that space is in the common interest of all mankind, in its words, and that any exploration or use should be carried on for the benefit of all peoples. Now, in 2015, Bezos's Blue Origin and Musk's SpaceX lobbied the Obama administration to enact what's called the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. It extends an exemption for commercial space companies for federal regulation, allowing them to own any mining resources extracted from asteroids and to keep the profits. It's a whole new enclosure of the commons. So it's perhaps no surprise that many of Silicon Valley's tech elite are invested in abandoning the planet, the desire to escape climate collapse and regulation at once. Space colonization fits well alongside the other fantasies of Silicon Valley, including life extension dieting, blood transfusions from teenagers, brain uploading to the cloud, and vitamins for immortality. It is a whispered summons to become the Übermensch, to exceed all boundaries, biological, social, ethical, and ecological. But as Mackenzie Walker's asked, should we think of this as any fundamentally different way than just a feral kind of capitalism, as somehow beyond the usual dystopia of Silicon Valley imaginations? Or could it be something much worse? If we need a new design ethos, it is to build alternative terrestrial visions with different modes of ecological homeostasis, to create what Achille Mbembe calls, and I quote, a different politics of inhabiting the earth, of repairing and sharing the planet, end quote. Or what J.K. Gibson Graham describes as ethical coordinates for a new kind of interdependence between humans, non-humans, and our ecologies. Maybe the alternative future we need is actually something quite prosaic and something quite simple, although it's certainly not easy to achieve. We just need to find a way to live within the capacities of the planet we are on. And that would also include resisting the tired, phallic spectacles of a new colonial frontier and AI techno-solutionism. Because after all, those dreams were never designed for us. I'll end things here. Thank you so much for joining today. I'll just turn off the slides so we can move to a conversation.
Thank you so much, Kate, for a wonderful contextualising and almost a polemic, a call to arms to actually really properly consider the issues that AI and the broader context around it, the broader cartography or atlas around it generates. And it absolutely demonstrates also that underneath all the data, the codes and our capitalism are bodies. There's a fleshy underbelly there that is often brutally dominated. So thank you very much. And today, as part of the research seminar presentation, we're first going to have a discussion between Professor Crawford and two experts who I'll just introduce shortly from the faculty at CNM. And afterwards, we'll move to a broader Q&A. And I do encourage all the punters, I welcome you now, who are in the Zoom room, to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can start doing that now, and we can work up to them after the discussion between Professor Crawford, Jack and Kokil. Okay, so I think we'll begin with Professor Jack Tew, who is the chair of the Research Committee in Communications and New Media and he is also an expert in issues of digital media, social change, and digital labour. So please begin, Jack.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Kate, for such a splendid talk. We are all learning so much from you, and this book is truly brilliant, okay, rigorously researched and beautifully written. You've curated so many bold ideas from the industry, the AI industry, and also from history, okay, that you skillfully also break them down, turn them inside out, and then demonstrate the consistent pattern of extractivism and solutionism, hubris and abuse, power and discrimination. As someone helping to organize, okay, this event today, I would also like to emphasize that Kate is doing this talk for us for free, okay, out of collegiality and solidarity in search for a more just and humane world, our collective digital future. So one of my goals tonight is to encourage everyone to buy this atlas, okay, and read it and cite it in your own work, especially in Asia, where popular discourses about AI and technology are often too simplistic and celebratory. This actually, okay, poses a special challenge. Okay, Kate may know I had an earlier book, okay, about technology and slavery, and many readers, could only finish the first half, okay, and then they don't read the second one because it's too dark for them, especially in Asia, okay, and knowing you and following your work for more than a decade, I thought I was prepared, okay, to read your critical analysis, but I was not, okay. Some of your writing and images, okay, like that Amazon cage, okay, you just showed, are so nerve-wracking and harrowing that I almost feel like watching a horror movie, okay. For example, like the way you were followed while you were leaving your research site, okay, in Western Texas. Okay, I could feel like watching a horror movie, literally. So this is my question: do you worry about this book being so distressing, okay, that it may put some readers off? Okay, and also, what would you say to those who are halfway through this atlas but do not have the courage to finish because they might be afraid of more disturbing encounters?
Thank you so much, Jack. And I wonder about this idea of the horror movie. And I think in some ways, if we're able to at least contend with just a small percentage of the horror that so many people experience every day as they're working and living reality, it's nothing compared to some of the workers that I met and spoke with, from mines through to Amazon fulfillment centers. I think in order to really own our own responsibility as people who use devices or may subscribe to Amazon Prime, that we actually move the curtain away and look at what it actually takes to make these systems work at scale. So to some degree, I guess I would encourage people that we sort of delve even further into the lived realities behind the computational systems that we've come to see as convenient. But I also agree with you that there's a real sense of shock and dismay. And for me, that was a really important thing to follow and to sit with when researching Atlas of AI. I have, as you know, I've been researching issues to do with artificial intelligence specifically for well over a decade now. But I had done so much of that, from sitting inside universities, from reading papers and going to conferences. And I don't think that's where we get a deep sense of actually what is really costing us to build these systems and who is paying that price, because it's rarely those of us who can afford iPhones, as indeed your work has shown, Jack. So I think one of the things that really shifted me in sort of change my thinking was to change my methodology for this book, to actually go to the places where we're seeing these sites of extraction, to go to the mines, to go to the factories, to go to the labs where the data sets are being created for machine learning, to sort of really put myself on the line and in the context of these spaces. And even that is just a tiny fraction of the experience of the people who are really, I think in many ways, seeing the brutal experiences of working to serve these systems. And I think about your book too, Jack, in Goodbye, I Slave, that it's interesting because in some ways, sort of the second half of your book is the more optimistic half. It's the half when you actually encourage people to find different ways to organize labor, to address these problems. And I think in some ways, Atlas 2, towards the end, actually gives different visions of how we might think about how we should use AI, how we should deploy it, and most importantly, where we should not deploy it, how we might begin to sort of strengthen a new muscle, which is the politics of refusal. How do we begin to say, no, we don't want facial recognition in our cities, or no, we don't want to be using emotion detection to decide who might be a good employee. Trying to find those different ways of inhabiting the planet, as Mbembe writes. These are the stories that I sort of close the book on. So I guess the other thing I would say is that I hope people can get to that sort of optimistic vision of how we work together across different fights for justice, to start to think differently about how we're actually deploying planetary computation and what it's costing us.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think, again, I want to encourage everyone to finish the book. In the second half of the book is much more bright, future looking, but also it shows, I love some part. The second part, there is also some humor, okay, like Project Maven, okay, the irony and the sarcasm. Look at the official seal. I just couldn't believe that's a real thing. Yeah, so there are so many layers, okay, in the second half of the book, yeah, that I really enjoyed and really want to thank you for. Yeah.
It's interesting too, because of course, Project Maven, it was one of the sort of early large-scale projects for object detection, which was a collaboration between Google and the US Department of Defense. So it was actually quite, in many ways has very serious and dark implications. But as you say, when you start to look at sort of corporate patches and design, there's this cognitive dissonance between the sort of comedic kind of jokey element and how these systems might actually be deployed in battlefield contexts. So, yes, there's certainly a humor there, but it's a humor that's a fairly troubling kind. I mean, but I'm with you. I would find artifacts like that and be shocked. Yeah,
dark
absolutely.
humor and irony. Yeah.
Mm.
Jack, did you have, I think you had some more questions for Kate.
Probably
as well.
we should have Kokil, yeah, first.
Okay.
Ask later, yeah.
Good idea. Okay, our next faculty member to work in discussion with Kate is Assistant Professor Kokil Jaidka, and she is the lead coordinator of the data communication specialisation in our new Masters of Social Science Comms degree. And her research work specialises in social media, computational language models, with a particular attention to self-presentation online. So please take it away, Kokil.
Hi, Kate. I really enjoyed your book. In fact, it was through your book that I learned some things about a university I had been at for 2 years. I was at Penn for 2 years as a postdoc, and I didn't know the story about the skulls. I didn't know the provenance of the artifacts in the museum until I read about them in your book. And I think that the shock I experienced when I read about that and other incidents in your book is the shock that any AI researcher might experience, because someone like me who interacts with these data sets for machine learning on a very regular basis, these are questions we don't think about. Where's this data coming from? What's its provenance? Who paid what price for this data to be in my hands? And I really appreciate the chance to go through, to have these thoughts and to have them shape my thinking in the future. I think especially to do with the role of getting machines to see, and your perspectives and your concerns about getting machines to see. Things like when you talk about how inductive inference is based on currently available data instead of the logical frame, and how the training data is shaping the boundary of the AI operations. That just brings into question whether how the ends are dictating the means and how it's just a vicious circle playing over and over. And I'd love to know what message you'd have for some of the people in the audience today. Our data and communication students are in the audience. Some of them are CEOs of their own companies. There are a lot of data professionals, executives, data communicators. They're all involved in the socio-technological landscape in either at the entry level or at the mid-career level. So what is the main message you'd like them to take away from your book?
Thank you, Kokil, for that really generous question and for sharing your experience. I had very similar experiences when I started really looking at training data. It's so often, I think, seen as just an infrastructure that you apply to create a model. You pull it off the shelf, you download it, you use it, but it's very rare that we stop and we look at what's inside it. And quite often there are truly horrific things inside training data sets that are just not seen because they are so scaled. I mean, because in many cases you'll have a training data set of 25 million images. Who has the time or capacity to look at these things? So I've had a very similar journey to you in doing that work. It certainly really transformed my thinking as well. In terms of what the main message I would say for people who are now starting out in the tech industry, and particularly those who are working on the technical side or even leading technical companies, I think it's a really important moment. I think about the last 5 years of work around what's been called loosely responsible AI, it's really focused on these ideas around algorithmic fairness and around outputs. How do we ensure that technical systems are not discriminating against people of color, against women, against the elderly, against the poor? Like, these are very real and serious questions that are still, I think, in many cases, not very completely answered. However, I guess this book is really asking us to go a step further even than that, and to say, let us look at the wider imprint of technical systems on the planet. Let's think about their environmental costs. Let's think about the hidden labor all along the supply chain. And let's think about our data practices. Let's think about where we get data from, how it's being used, and the types of classifications that are baked into the data that we just tend to see as a neutral infrastructure. So I think these are actually, in some ways, quite practical steps that people in the tech industry can actually embrace. And we're starting to see some, I think, really positive signs. We're starting to see more environmentally efficient methods for doing machine learning. I'm thinking here of the work of Emma Strubel at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and others. These are people who are really focusing on, at the very least, surfacing the true carbon footprint of conducting work in, say, computer vision or NLP. But we're also seeing people experiment with ideas like zero-shot learning, ways to minimize data collection, to be able to still produce systems that are highly effective, but do not require, vast training sets that use enormous amounts of GPUs. So I see these as extremely exciting developments that, again, people in the tech industry can make choices now. You can choose to use a data center that's powered by thermal energy or by a coal-fired power plant. These are choices you get to make. So there's actually some really material interventions you can make. You can choose to pay crowd workers a living wage. You can choose to think differently about how and where you use data. So I guess I would encourage people to look at the next wave of computation and think, how can we actually shift some of these, I think, unconscious practices that have developed over the last 15 years, where people, in many cases, just thought, GPUs are forever. Compute doesn't cost much, so let's use as much as possible. The shift towards large language models and large image models without necessarily thinking about the back-end computational costs. So to move beyond that phase and to be far more conscious and far more considered around the systems that we build, I think that would be the overarching message of the book.
Thank you. We might go back to Jack to continue this conversation.
Yes, one thing I really love about this book is the shift away from consumerist. Okay, it's like ethical AI is about consumer choice. Okay, we can choose better. Okay, but you actually call for something much bigger, structural change. So here I'd like to ask about the role of governments, okay, including intelligence agencies. Okay, for example, Snowden's PRISM, okay, that revelation that you studied in this book. So can the powers that be play a better role. Okay, you have a chapter devoted to states. Okay, this whole chapter was, I think, almost all of it is about the US, right? So what about the EU? Okay, the month this book came out, in the same month, earlier this year, the EU announced a new legal framework. It's a white paper. Now they built a new legal framework, okay, to regulate AI systems based on the risk. There are 4 levels of risk, right? Like a high risk or low risk. Okay, so in what way, okay, do you think this is a good structural change, or maybe it's still not good enough to counter the kind of extractivism that you critique? In particular, I'm asking because if you look at intergovernmental regional organizations around the world, after the EU, probably the world's second most active regional intergovernmental body is ASEAN, okay, where Singapore, okay, is a member of. So can we do better than the EU to respect and also recognition with recognition of what EU has already done? But can we do better in ASEAN or other parts of the world for the governments?
A great question, Jack. Certainly, I've paid a lot of attention to the EU Draft AI Act. And it's very interesting because, of course, it's the first omnibus act attempting to regulate artificial intelligence. And I think for that alone, it should be praised. But by looking at the specifics, and of course, it uses a sort of a pyramid model of risk where it has, unacceptable risk, high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And it sort of has applications being sort of allocated to various parts of the pyramid. If you look at that closely, there's really very little that's off limits in terms of this act. The only types of technologies that are banned are ones that are sort of clearly designed to produce particular kinds of fraud and harm through manipulation, and others that are sort of specifically particular kinds of uses of biometrics in public space. But I think there are many kinds of applications that sort of shift between those categories, that they can be high risk in some contexts and low risks in others, that in actual fact, technologies modulate very much depending on who is using them, where, and who is actually suffering those harms. So I think we need a much more adaptive and granular approach to thinking about how we regulate. The other thing I would say about the EU Act is that it's actually quite narrowly framed. In some ways, we were discussing, the focus of the last 5 years on ideas around algorithmic fairness, around sort of improving data set quality, around sort of restricting the use of biometric tracking. Those themes are very clear and present in the Act. But what you don't see are these broader questions around labor, around the environment, around sort of these deeper imprints that are being left by the industry, all these kinds of structural harms that I think come from the practices that I've articulated in this book. And perhaps that's asking too much for one piece of legislation to contend with. And I think in many cases, these sorts of problems do actually need to be addressed by bespoke types of interventions and ultimately quite different legislative approaches. There isn't going to be one perfect AI Act to solve it all. That's simply just not possible. So in terms of the space for ASEAN, I think there's an enormous space here. And certainly because if you think about many of the ASEAN nations, the countries that are actually bearing the greatest costs, if you think about precisely where things like e-waste tips are located, where many of the crowd worker labeling farms are housed, and where we're seeing, as indeed your work has also shown, types of extreme labor exploitation and injury. ASEAN nations know this intimately. So these could, in many ways, this could be the place for I think, much more equitable vision around how do we actually regulate these kinds of technologies and forms of industrial production. But we're yet to see that, Jack, but that would be my highly optimistic future of what could happen at ASEAN. But certainly, I think in some ways, we do have a time clock here. We are looking at a really quite extraordinary consolidation of power and industrial influence in the tech sector right now. And certainly since the pandemic, many of the forces and articulations in this book have only become more extreme, not less extreme. You know, we've seen, of course, you know, Amazon increase its wealth and power dramatically in just 16 months. The same is true of all of the major tech companies. As we've seen people sort of move into this environment of, you know, working from home and being mediated by screens, just as we are right now, we become yet more data points and again, the sort of workplace surveillance tools or so-called bossware that's being used on people in these very environments, I think is deeply concerning and extends those logics that we see in Amazon fulfillment houses into people's living rooms and bedrooms. So this is the shift that I think requires some real urgency. And in some ways, I think legislators are always playing a game of catch up at the moment. We're still trying to patch the holes in the EU draft act before we're even getting to these wider questions that you've raised. So certainly, I think, you know, we have some serious challenges ahead.
Thank you, Kate.
Excellent. Kokil, would you like to join in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll take things on a different track. A good seg from talking about the role of government is the talking of the possibility of decentralization, because there have been some ideas and there have been steps to encourage the public exchange of AI for social, public exchange of data and AI technology for social good, especially companies like Google and Amazon create these APIs so that they can maybe help or facilitate some work by researchers or enable some technologies, enable some disaster relief, for example, the kind of work that Facebook does. In these scenarios, though, we are still quite at the mercy of the whole complex. We are still at the mercy of these big companies to share data, even though it's data they collected from us and it belongs to us. I don't know if you have I don't know if you want to illustrate or elaborate on some ideas, some other ways in which we could decentralize these powers. Are there other ways we can illuminate parts and populations of the world that are currently overshadowed or underdeveloped because AI does not reach or benefit them?
Thank you so much, Kokil. Let's think first about this question around APIs and data sharing. You've mentioned a few in terms of where data is available, but I immediately think of all the places where the data pipeline has been switched off. In some cases, very dramatically. We've had a case that has reached international headlines with Facebook trying to shut down research being done by a team at NYU here in New York City, which caused enormous consternation across the entire research community. I'm also thinking of the ways in which services can be switched off in the processes of negotiations with governments, to connect back to the earlier question. I'm also thinking here of Facebook, who, when they were in negotiations over the media ownership laws in Australia, decided to switch off the news feed entirely, essentially rendering a news blackout across Australia, both in terms of being able to engage with organizations, but also for many Australian news organizations and NGOs to engage with the wider world. And so seeing these kinds of actions of pulling the plug, I think are very powerful and important lessons for understanding both what those kinds of, I think, quite horrifying negotiation tactics can look like, which is that, you know, services can simply say, that's it, we're switching you off, in order to try and change legislative outcomes or regulatory outcomes. I think it should also make us think exactly about what you've asked, which is decentralization. And in many ways, you know, decentralization was a sort of a dirty word 20 years ago, when everything was about sort of reconnecting the internet, and we don't want to have like sort of nationalized or even smaller types of units of networking and data sharing. But I think now so many people are looking to how decentralization can help. But the question yet again is going to be, you know, what do those nodes look like? Are we talking about hyper-localized mesh networks? Are we talking about city-level networks? Are we talking about communities within cities? every order of operation, or of what the sort of scale order is, I think raises different kinds of questions around how we organize, build, and maintain those networks. I mean, maintenance here is nothing to be sneezed at. These are very serious processes to actually maintain decentralized networks. So I think we always have to sort of think about those long-term maintenance horizons. But nonetheless, I'm agreeing with you that I think that decentralization and thinking about different paths of using and sharing data between communities is certainly one of the most interesting paths forward. I guess I would also put this to you, because I would love to hear this in your work, Kokil, in terms of where you are seeing decentralization take place and where you're seeing sort of potential there, be it sort of at a technical level or sort of more broadly at a community level.
That's a good question. I do think in my thinking of decentralization, what I'm trying to incorporate is data collections and basically data processes and research that involves people who are traditionally marginalized from these data, from the benefits of these data processes, or from the benefits of these research studies, when research usually focuses on a certain demographic, be it a social media demographic or a population demographic. A lot of people who are sidelined. One of the projects that I've been exploring is to do with the migrant population and the working class migrant population in Singapore, and their experiences of social media, especially during a pandemic. That's just one example of another project that I've been thinking about and developing on, is around standards of beauty and how they adversely impact differently abled people online. Specifically, there's a Love My Selfie hashtag that's started by someone who's a phenomenal influencer. She happens to also be physically disabled, and that creates a whole toxic environment for her. But I think these decentralized pockets of power should be empowered where they can be, and by people who can, by at least raising their voices. Those are some of the ways I'm thinking about this. The other thing I'm trying to do is question the algorithms, question the technological platforms that allow these power dynamics to exist, that don't challenge the status quo. For that is arduous, and that does face a lot of backlash. A single paper can get a stinging rebuttal, but it's a process, and it's a process I plan to keep going at. Thanks for asking that question.
Oh, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your work. That is incredibly interesting to me. And I, in addition to, I would love to read your work, particularly around the study that you're doing around migrant populations in Singapore. But in particular, let me say that, it's so important that you continue to do these papers that question algorithmic logics and platforms, even when they do get those stinging rebuttals. I think that's how we actually begin to change the field. So it's really wonderful to hear about that work. And it's interesting, you've made me think of something that's another, shall we say, after so many quite depressing stories, here's a somewhat optimistic one too. The largest machine learning conference in the world, NeurIPS, introduced just for the first time last year the requirement that papers have an impact statement, which is that in addition to sort of writing about your new algorithm or your new training data set or your new model, you actually also have to include a statement about, well, what might be the broader impacts if this was applied in the world. Now, interestingly, there was huge pushback from many parts of the sort of hardcore technical community saying, why should we have to do this? This is not our training or not our interest. But it's slowly being incorporated. And what we're seeing in year 2 now is more of a kind of a checklist approach, which asks authors to really think about these questions around, the ethics and social implications of what they're building and designing. And I think in some ways that is slowly but surely producing a different kind of conversation where it's not just about technical innovation that's being lionized or, increasing your hyperparameters on a model, but actually looking at what does it mean when it is applied in the world and how will people's lives be affected, either for better or worse, or in some cases, both. So I think that is a sign that I would say that, those papers that you're doing and that work that you're contributing is actually moving into a community that is slowly changing these norms and having, I think, in some ways, deeper conversations about the impacts of computational systems.
Absolutely. A few months ago, I was working with the editorial committee of a different conference, and we were looking at these data statements that NeurIPS has incorporated and some journals have incorporated, because it's going to become the norm. And we were pushing each other. We have to do this or be left behind, because this is going to become the new standard and we should be the ones setting the standard. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
My pleasure. Fantastic.
Many thanks, Prof. Crawford and Prof. Jaidka there, as well as Prof. Q for some fantastic discussion. And I think we can move it now to open up a little bit to the Zoom room and some of our participants. We've got quite an active Q&A board here, and there's the upvote function. So I'm going to follow the most upvoted questions here. And I'm going to open up first to Nathaniel Tan. So I think now, Nathaniel, you should be unmuted. So could you please ask Kate your question? If not, I'll just read it out. So he says, yeah. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It sheds light on the darker sides of the AI industry. Prof. Crawford spoke about the politics of refusal. This would naturally be rejected by corporations in power, which are currently exploiting AI. Do you have any ideas on how to facilitate broader societal level discussions and the establishment of a consensus on a future without AI?
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Let's think about, for a minute, about where we're starting to see the politics of refusal. We could think of some very specific sites just in the last couple of years. So if we take facial recognition as a type of canonical example, there have been many cities around the world that have either banned or seriously limited the use of facial recognition in their cities. We could think here of Portland, of San Francisco, of Oakland, of Somerville. And certainly parts of Europe as well have certainly selectively restricted this technology and by particular parties, be it by the police or in public space. So I think we can look to this in two different ways. The optimistic read is that we're starting to see this type of a politics of refusal of some types of technology in some types of contexts. But perhaps one of the more sort of concerning interpretations is this is really coming from cities that are very wealthy, that are very tech literate. I mean, San Francisco, after all, home of so many of the people who work in tech companies, choosing to ban facial recognition is very telling. But how does that then go to many other cities that do not have those same infrastructures or those same debates or the same wealth that goes along with the ability to sort of create these types of movements and actually, produce that type of legislative change? I think we need to think about how do we support these discussions more widely, sort of outside of those kind of high net worth and high tech worker cities. So certainly in terms of what that looks like, though, I think it's going to look different depending on where in the world it is and which communities are agitating. And that's rightly so. It should be really based by what communities are feeling and which technologies they wish to say are not suitable for use. But perhaps the other deeper question you ask is, how do we get to have that discussion? And here, I think You're pointing to a deep issue, which is that for many systems, they're actually invisible. They're built into the back ends of how data is being processed. So, it's in some ways almost easier to talk about things like facial recognition as a type of megafauna, because you see a camera, you understand what it means to have your face being recorded and analyzed. I think it's much harder when we think about the sort of more dispersed forms of data that are being collected and then compared to each other, creating all sorts of predictive privacy harms as well. So that idea around what gets to be seen and not seen, I think, is important, because we'll note that the types of technologies that have the most resistance around them are the ones that are the most visible and easy to understand. So to some degree, what we need to do is to sort of shed light on these sort of back-end systems and technologies that get far less attention, to look at everything such as Kokil and I have been discussing around training data, around the sorts of classificatory logics that get built into systems. How do we begin to protest the fact that so many systems have binary gender, which in 2021 seems absolutely retrograde, or have these incredibly, I think, problematic ideas around race baked into them, where people's races are being sort of dictated based on what their face looks like. These are the kinds of logics that I think are incredibly harmful, and certainly I think are far less the sort of focus of protest. So that can come from different communities too. That can come from technical communities, from research communities like this one. So it's a long answer, but I guess what I would say is, if we think sort of specifically about the sort of types of functions and ways of seeing and tools that are the most harmful, that's where action, I think, can be produced, but it needs to be produced at a local level. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kate. Another one that's bringing quite a lot of discussion in the Q&A box is from Gilbert May, and I'll just read it aloud. He writes, "I'm interested in what, if any, specificity there is to artificial intelligence and the consequences in solutionism, exploitation and extraction and inequities, etc., in contrast to the non-intelligent computational technical systems. Many of the political and ethical implications you have been speaking about are applicable to computational systems which are not explicitly AI or involved in machine learning. The environmental externalization, capitalist exploitation of labour, corporate control of consciousness or human actions are equally attributable to non-AI, non-machine learning algorithms. Is your focus on AI an opportunity to intervene in a current topic? It seems to me that this approach potentially risks perhaps not seeing so clearly the driver of the adverse effects you detail, given, as you pointed out, that they were evident under non-AI algorithms and are even the consequences of Fordist pre-Silicon Valley era industrialism." So a bit of a long question there, but there's certainly been a lot of back and forth with participants too. So I guess this broader question about what of the non-intelligent type of intelligences?
I love this question, and I want to completely agree that exactly, indeed, these are dynamics which have not just been baked into computation more widely, but in information capitalism itself, which we can track back over several centuries. And that's really the point of the book, is to look at what are these deeper logics of which AI is, I think, an exemplar. And why is it an exemplar? If, as you say, why focus on this sort of this term, this idea, and this industrial infrastructure? I think because in many ways, AI could only happen with planetary computation. It actually relies on that. And in many ways, it is precisely the function that could only come out of being able to collect vast amounts of data from huge populations around the world, from using exactly that type of cloud backbone architecture, which is planetary in scale, and drawing on dispersed labor platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk. So in some ways, AI is that kind of Frankenstein creature, which brings together all of those features, which have really become, from, again, centuries of change, but some of these particular outgrowths like again, dispersed to worker platforms, large data collection, and supercompute models have really only been possible in the last decade. So we're actually looking at a very recent formation, which has, I think, accelerated and amplified those underlying conditions. So I think in some ways, artificial intelligence, particularly if we look at the last years, shows us how we're seeing precisely those long histories become amplified into a very specific set of technologies, which are held in very few hands, literally by sort of fewer than a dozen companies worldwide, depending how you count. And if you look at the companies that control planetary cloud, you're really only talking about 5 companies. So that is different. That is one of the most intensely concentrated industrial architectures in our history. And I think we do need to speak about both why AI continues an industrial trajectory and a series of capitalist logics, and also is specific in terms of those intensifications and why it needs to be looked at very closely, and why systems like large-scale social scoring and biometric recognition and worker surveillance and algorithmic management are particular and are actually things that are worth looking at in as a whole, both in terms of their history, but how they're changing the way we're living right now. So I guess that's a yes and response to your question, that yes, those histories are real, and obviously AI only works because that existing computational infrastructure has been built over 60 years. But we have now reached a point where it has been amplified into something very specific and new.
Absolutely, Kate, and thank you for that conjunctural answer, considering the present conditions, but also how they are underpinned by a history, which I really felt you brought forward in the presentation with the example of Babbage and the example of the cutting, the abattoir example. Fantastic. I'm going to read Fion E's question next. They write, touching on Membe's words, it is quoted that biopower functions through, quote, dividing people into those who must live and those who must die, close quotes. I would just like to ask, in relation to surveillance and policing, how we might mediate such biases within the AI system in itself, so that biopower may be kept at bay through AI and might tackle some of these problems which perpetuate deeply rooted and systemic racism.
Fantastic. Thank you for this question. So as you would know, there's a very live debate happening at the moment about biopower and what the philosopher Benjamin Bratton describes as both positive and negative interpretations of biopower. And this is coming out, interestingly, out of Agamben's work in sort of thinking about, this idea of, the bodies that live and the bodies that die, which Bratton describes as a sort of a highly negative biopolitics, which is unable to contend with what is happening under a pandemic, when you need different types of global-based action, and the sort of regulation of bodies sort of reemerges through, I think, this far more epidemiological model, where people are, I think in many ways having debates around, what it is to have passports for entry based on vaccination, to have scanning and data every time you go into a shop or a restaurant, which is true in some countries and not in others. And what I find interesting about this is, of course, Bratton's argument is that these are good interventions. We actually need to make sure that people are vaccinated, that we can have proof of vaccination, that we can have methods of tracking populations around these epidemiological issues. And that in some ways, the kind of traditional Foucauldian and sort of Agamben versions of biopower are very poorly constructed to deal with this. I sort of take more of a middle path on this. I think that certainly the forms of biopower discussed by Mbembe and Agamben are incredibly powerful when thought of in specific contexts, particularly when we look at sort of the context of what happens in war, what happens in places of particular forms of bodily harm, harassment, and violence. But I do think we are being challenged now to think also about, what are the ways in which planetary sensing is beneficial? What are the ways in which tracking bodies around these issues of health can also be helpful? And here, I also look to many of my global health colleagues and people who've worked on issues around HIV prevention for a long time, who've looked at sort of community work, what it is for communities to be, helping, informing, and guiding each other. So, I think that there's a sort of, as a sort of an answer to say to you, I think there's a nuanced position that's starting to emerge that is in some ways exciting to me, that we're reinvigorating debates about biopower, but also that's coming under the cloud of this moment of how do we contend with crises that are global in scale, a pandemic being, by its very nature, a world event, climate change by its very nature, a world event. So how do we start to think at a planetary scale while at the same time avoiding these types of AI logics about sort of extreme classification, extraction, and harm through surveillance? That is a very, I think, difficult and complex set of questions, and certainly ones that I think the next 10 years are really going to be forcing us to ask.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. I'm just going to move to a question. It was actually in the chat, but many people have said, oh, please ask this one. So this is from Ifan Wan, and she says, thanks, Prof. Crawford, for a great presentation. I was wondering what you think of concrete resistance potentials enabled by, so like kind of seeded by, or suitable for AI. I'm thinking of how in the 19th and 20th century, labour movements often did things like blocked railroads for coal transport, or miners went on strike, and how oil pipelines have made this particularly difficult in the 20th century. Timothy Mitchell's argument that oil infrastructure disabled the earlier coal era for democratic workers' protests, for example. Ifan asks, are there new possibilities of resistance within the digital infrastructure situation? Or does the new digital infrastructure make resistance even harder? What are some examples, perhaps, of resistance movements that could do this kind of sabotage or deal with AI from within?
Lovely.
Yes.
Thank you, Ifan. This is a great question. And I want to sort of also thank you for bringing up Timothy Mitchell's work in this context, which I think is really relevant. So I think digital resistance is happening. It's absolutely part of this discussion. So the question is, how does it work and who gets to do it? So certainly in the US, the big focus has been on tech workers being the side of resistance. So there are groups like Tech Won't Build It, really encouraging tech workers to draw a line and say, no, we won't build, for example, military technologies, or we won't build technologies that will assist ICE in deporting immigrants from the United States. And this is a really important space. And certainly, there's a long history too. We can look back to sort of key figures in the 20th century who in many ways actually would go and physically break parts of machinery during World War II to try and strengthen the capacity for the resistance to work against things like concentration camps. I mean, there's many stories about Holoranth machines sort of being sabotaged to try and prevent forms of population tracking and control that would, that were, again, sort of hallmarks of the Nazi regime. So in some ways, we're now starting to see sort of similar discussions happen in the tech worker communities around how do you say what shouldn't be built. But I also want to say that these ideas around tech resistance, I think, can move outside of just tech workers, that shouldn't be the only space of privilege, that we should be looking at other forms of resistance that are collective. And I also want to make a really specific point here that I worry when this becomes focused on the individual, that it's up to us to sort of, choose the right technology or to fight against the ones that are problematic. This is ultimately happening at a structural level. And so I think structural responses are the most helpful ones. So again, that tends to mean a combination of, really you could call it sort of collaborations between different sorts of justice movements. And so we're seeing people who are working in climate justice, working with people around labor rights. We're seeing people working in data protection, working with people who are addressing issues around, the supply chain. So trying to bring these groups together, I think, is where we're going to see the greatest impact. And that's certainly a point that I make in the book in the conclusion, is like, where do I see the greatest hope? It's in precisely those forms of collaboration across forms of social justice movements that have in many cases in the past been separate, but I think now are actually working together in really powerful ways.
Thank you. We've got time for one last question, and this one's from Aileen Franske, and she writes, "Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I'm currently working on my PhD and doing my ethics guidelines." Her thesis is on ethics guidelines in big data research, excuse me. What do you think? How should ethics guidelines look? How could they work, and how should they be implemented? So this got a lot of upvotes, and yes, Aileen, I appreciate a response. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. And it's a great topic for a PhD, so I really look forward to seeing this work when you've completed it. Obviously, one of the things that's been very noticeable in the last 3 years has been this profusion of ethics guidelines and ethics statements. And they've come from many different corners. They've come from NGOs, they've come from tech companies, they've come from worker groups. There's certainly this idea of how do we create an ethical guidelines for people who are going to be building these systems or deploying them. And I think that's been a very interesting response for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it is certainly necessary, but not sufficient, that we have ethical guidelines. It does promote different sorts of conversations around what are the values behind the way that technical systems are being built. And certainly here, we can think of, there have been multiple studies that have been published in recent years that have looked at the types of themes. I'm thinking here of Anna Jobin's work. She wrote a paper that looked and studied and compared many different types of ethics guidelines to think about, what are the things that tend to be drawn out. But my concern sometimes about the way that these guidelines are framed is that they very rarely intersect with an accountability structure. So it's one thing to have ethical guidelines, but if there's no way to ensure that they are enforced or that anyone's actually observing them, then we have to ask about their longer term effectiveness, which is one of the reasons that I say in the book that ethics is not enough and we need to be focusing on power, which is precisely a way of saying, rather than just saying, oh, here are a sort of a high level set of things that would be good to do, such as do no harm, let's actually look at who is empowered by a system, and actually let's look at where the harms are actually being located and who is experiencing those. Because time and time again, it tends to be those communities who are already marginalized and disempowered who are experiencing the greatest downsides. So I think ethics statements, while they're really necessary, and I think an important discussion, need to be sort of back-ended with some sort of almost sort of connective tissue to systems of decision-making and accountability. And I think that's what's going to give them much more efficacy in the world. But thanks for the question.
Excellent. Thank you, Prof. Crawford. We'll wrap up now, and I'm just want to really share the enthusiasm for what a lively presentation and also a discussion that's been going on here. It's so wonderful to have all these people in the Zoom room thinking about these key issues around how power operates through AI structures. I've just dropped in the chat again the link to Kate's book, which we've discussed this evening, The Atlas of AI. And of course, you can order this through Yale and perhaps your local bookshop, or for your library at your institution would be fabulous. And I know we don't have the little clap emoji, but thank you for participating, and you perhaps clap in the comments there. So please stay in touch, follow us on Twitter, CNMNUS. For updates about further research events. But I just would like to thank again Prof. Crawford for her time, generosity, and just an absolutely provocative and interesting presentation this evening. And I really congratulate you again on your fantastic publication and your ongoing work. We look forward to seeing more. We might quickly take a photo just of the four of us. But if we could smile, I'll take, and Chang Wen, if you want to take a double just for good measure, that'll be good. So if the four of us can smile, 1, 2.
Smiling for the Zoom room. Can
Yeah.
I say a giant thank you to you, Rosemary, and to you, Jack, and to you, Kokil, and to Audrey for the lovely introduction as well. This was such a fantastic discussion. And thank you all for joining and for asking this incredible list of questions. And I'm sorry there's so many we couldn't get to, but it's been such a pleasure to see you all. And hopefully I will get to come and visit you and see you in person sometime next year.
Yes, we hope to host you as soon as well. Okay, so thank you, and we'll see you.
Yes, especially now that I know what kind of breakfast we will treat you while you're in Singapore. You're a fan of laksa, okay? Like
I'm a huge fan of laksa, so count me in. Thank you so much, friends. Have a great
day. Thank you everyone for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a great day. Bye.